this month I'm going to go do a workshop on spiritual autobiographies, which I am looking forward to. And in advance of that workshop, the conveners gave us a list of suggested spiritual memoirs to read, which is a nice list for some summer reading, I think. So I read Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain recently, which I had never read before. I knew of Thomas Merton, obviously, and if you're not familiar with him, he was a Catholic Trappist monk at the Gethsemane Monastery, which is just in Kentucky, not very far away from here. And I've obviously read a lot of devotions and meditations by him over the years, but I really didn't know anything about his life or his conversion. And I certainly didn't know that he was raised by parents very much in a sort of hyper-modernist frame of mind, and was raised and most of his adolescent and young adult life as a very convicted atheist. And a pretty pessimistic one at that. He actually had a very powerful line early in his memoirs where he described himself as the consummate 20th century man, raised in the age of the atomic bomb and poison gases, living under the shadow of the apocalypse, whose veins ran with poison and death. Just to give you a little taste of the worldview that he was working with. And he described a moment walking past a bookshop in New York and picking up a book on medieval philosophy, being aghast at first to realize that obviously this meant that it was going to be a book of Catholic philosophy. He was like, I sort of knew that that was what I was getting into, but I didn't quite realize that I was getting into such decided Catholic philosophy. And that became the seed from which ultimately grew not just his baptism and his conversion into the Catholic Church, but ultimately his monastic vocation, and really from that, this life of writing and flourishment that became a source of incredible spiritual inspiration for many, 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 many people. And I think it's such an interesting story, right, to look at in light of today's parables. These two little, almost like mini parables from the Gospel of Mark. Because if there is one thing I take away from Thomas Merton's conversion, is that it was certainly not anything he decided on for himself. It was certainly not instantaneous, but it was incredibly pervasive. Pervasive word of God. Pause as the bells give us a moment for contemplation. There we go. And I will confess, I always have some mixed feelings when we come across these gardening metaphors in the Bible. I have whatever the opposite of a green thumb is. I often feel like when plants look at me, they just go, all right, we'll lose the will to live now because it'll be faster for all of us than whatever prolonged death and misery this woman has in store for us. And I think about that because we have one of our students who made the really unfortunate decision to leave me some of her plants to water in my office for a couple of weeks. And I'm living in profound anxiety about that. But I do take some comfort from this parable because there is some assurance that the growth of plants, the harvest, the blooming, is not entirely up to us, right? And I think those of you who perhaps are maybe better gardeners than me will know that. Sometimes you do everything exactly right and the plant just it doesn't go well. And sometimes you know, despite our incompetencies perhaps, plants somehow manage not to die, even when someone like me is left to care for them. And that is the image we see in these parables of God's kingdom in Mark's gospel. Both the gardener who goes out and plants some seeds and then goes to sleep and doesn't seem to do much about them and wakes up in the morning to find that the mysterious work of creation and nature has done its thing while he sleeps and the harvest is ready. And that image of the mustard seed, which is perhaps a familiar one to us. And I want to start first with the mustard seed. Let's start there in these two parables. Because again, I think the image of, have faith as small as a mustard seed is a line that we hear about a lot. But I think sometimes we don't always entirely understand what the parable of the mustard seed is saying. Right? And I think maybe that's one of the moments where the cultural awareness and the cultural gap between us and the gospel is a bit of a hindrance. So let's, for a moment, imagine that instead of the mustard plant, we're talking about kudzu. Anyone else here from the South? There you go. Right? So the kudzu is the vine that ate the South. This plant that just takes over everything. The mustard seed plant is not a crop. This was not something that people would intentionally harvest, plant to harvest and cultivate. It was this pervasive growth. And when Jesus is using this image of the mustard plant to talk about God's kingdom, he's talking about this pervasiveness of God's kingdom that grows, that takes over, despite what we do or what we don't do, despite any kind of control that we may want to have over it. God's kingdom, the movement of God's presence in this world, often happens despite us as much as because of us. And I think that is, again, to go backwards, a helpful framing for the story of the gardener growing this seed in Mark's gospel. Mark is the only gospel that tells of the sower sowing the seed in this way. He's the only one that includes this detail about the sower planting the seed and then going off to go to sleep. And I think Mark is intentionally trying to lean into this idea that is both unsettling in one way and maybe comforting in another way, of recognizing that the movement and the growth and the expansion of God's kingdom is not something that is the direct result of us. Is something that comes into being and flourishing not as a direct result of anything that we do, and is not something that we can control. Which I think is something that for us can be both overwhelming and reassuring, right? And I think there are times when we want to feel as though we have the power and agency to fix, to make the kingdom happen now, to take care of everything that is broken and wrong in the world around us. But there is also a reassurance that that's not what God expects of us. That's not what God asks of us. There is an honesty in sitting with our incapacity. For example, I cannot control your attention while my children are trying to buy pipes right behind me. I feel it happening. I see it happening. Let's just name the realities that are beyond our control. Putting that out. But I think here again is where Thomas Merton's life story and the way he tells his story is really powerful to us. Because again, there is something very real and potent in Thomas Merton's personal story, personal narrative of the work and presence and the manifestation of the kingdom of God in his life personally. But again, we go back to that line he gives about being the consummate 20th century man. That incredibly stark image of living under the shadow of apocalypse, the looming nuclear age and the Cold War and all of the anxiety and upheaval that comes along with that. I think Merton does an incredibly powerful job of setting his personal narrative in the context of the global reality in which he lived and grew up. he has a powerful line that I wanted to share where he talks about how it seems that it is only by God's grace that humanity has managed not to destroy God's creation. When we look at the realities of evil and death. But he talks about people seem to think that it is a proof that no merciful or loving God exists, given the reality of war and sin and evil, if we have so many wars. On the contrary, consider how, in spite of so many centuries of sin and greed and lust and cruelty and avarice and hatred and oppression and injustice, spawned and bred by the free wills of men, the human race can still recover each time and produce men and women who overcome evil with good, hatred with love, greed with charity, lust and cruelty with sanctity. How could this be possible without the merciful love of God pouring out his grace upon us? And as we sit with that image of God's kingdom, and we sit in the tension of both the hope of God's kingdom that is pervasive beyond our limitations, and the reality of our inability to bring in that kingdom on our own, we remember that what we are called to is that persistent work of faithfulness, tending, watering, weeding, taking care of the garden of the world that God has given us, and living in the hope that the harvest will be